Hello and welcome back to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 67, The Insider, part 2 of 3. And without further ado, we'll just remind you where we'd got to, and we're going to set the context. We're going to hear again the heads of the 7 big tobacco firms denying that they believe nicotine is addictive. And just before we hear that, here's Lisa Gerrard, which we played out with last week, with music from the score of the movie, singing us in. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy.
Let me begin my questioning on the matter of whether or not nicotine is addictive. Let me ask you first, and I'd like to just go down the row, whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it, and just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no, and again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
So, I mean, unbelievable chutzpah by those CEOs just sitting there going, no, nicotine addictive, no. And it kind of, I think, this is mid-90s. Everybody knew smoking was bad for you by now. The way they were trying to nail them down was, were they aware that it was bad and they weren't doing anything about it? I don't know. The reality on all of that, so the bit about the dramatisation has become slightly more apparent. The timeline has been significantly compressed as the period bit of Bergman trying to get Jeffrey Wigand on board with 60 Minutes actually went on for quite a long time. Wigand's wife, Lucretia Lanier, in the movie, she was very concerned about him coming out in the open because of their severance package, and he started a teaching job, which we'll get to in a bit in the movie, which paid $30,000 a year as opposed to his previous $300,000 at B&W. And when they started mentioning B&W, I was thinking, B&W? Is he working for a car manufacturer now? No, it's B&W, but it does sound the same. I've not found any evidence that Wigand was called back to sign a supplement to the original confidentiality agreement, and it may not have been necessary, as Lowell Bergman has said that the original one was incredibly thorough and watertight. At the same time, as he says, it was his job and 60 Minutes' job to get people to talk, so he was never too concerned about these sorts of things. Also, the intimidating man at the golf course is a fiction, and one that nearly led to B&W taking on Disney, who owned the distribution company for the movie, who they produced the movie over an implied suggestion that they threatened one of their former employees. And that could have been a very interesting case, because they did threaten and intimidate one of their employees, or people did. The accusation that Bergman sold him out is unlikely to have happened, although everyone who dealt with Jeffrey Wigand said he could be very prickly at times, he was prone to a flash temper, and he was very scared. And furthermore, his name would probably have already been known to B&W executives as someone who was possibly looking to turn against them, because his name would already been associated with various anti-tobacco lobbying groups as well as the FDA. So he's not completely under the radar at this stage. He'd also done some off-record work with ABC News, who were looking into another tobacco company, namely Philip Morris. All the background stuff about his previous employment is true. He worked at all the places listed. He was a huge fan of James Burke, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, who he felt was a very ethical CEO. And he had worked in Japan, where he became a judo black belt, learned the language and embraced the culture. So when we see him eating in a Japanese restaurant and sitting cross-legged on a cushion in a traditional sense, that's very spot on. He absolutely loved his time in Japan. So there we go. So again, yes, there's some time compression. There's one fiction with this intimidating guy at the golf course. It may have happened. It just turns out that it was just a guy shooting golf balls,
But as we've suggested, it's shaping up to be one of the more accurate films that we've looked into, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah.
Okay, so back to the action. We see Bergman, Wallace and his team discuss what they think that Wigand may have for them. They've been watching the clip of the Seven Dwarves denying nicotine is addictive, and they know that this is their standard response. The journalists all know that everyone knows that smoking is bad, so it can't be evidence about that. Bergman says that his guy is the ultimate insider, considering the post that he'd had. Mike Wallace says that when it comes to a public health matter, they can't hide behind a corporate secrecy agreement. But another team member points out that the big companies always get high-priced lawyers to tie people up in endless suits, gagging orders and so forth. Most people can't find the money or the time to fight big tobacco. Bergman suggests engineering a court case where their insider will be compelled to give evidence in a public court, and no confidentiality agreement will have any hold over the court's jurisdiction. We then see Jeffrey Wigand applying for a job as a teacher. The lady interviewing him hears that he's worked in the tobacco industry. She stares at him until he sheepishly smiles, gets up and leaves. Back home we see his wife in tears as they realise they're going to have to leave their palatial home. They move into a new house. It's smaller but still nice, and Wigand then does some gardening with his daughters. Wigand is later on woken by his younger daughter during the night. She says that she's heard somebody in the garden. Wigand goes down to the basement, opens a safe, and takes one of the 3 handguns we see there and goes into the garden to investigate. He sees a raccoon and then returns to the house and tells his daughter that that's all the noise was. But while he was out, he's seen boot prints in the vegetable patch where he and his daughters had been planting earlier that day. Back inside the house, Wigand calls Bergman and tells him that he may be being followed. We learn that he has a job teaching high school Japanese and chemistry. Bergman says that he was going to call him anyway in case he wanted to use what he knew about things. As soon as he hangs up, the phone rings again, but there's nobody on the line. So the suggestion that someone's listening in and making intimidating phone calls back to Wigand's line. Next we see Wigand meet with Bergman in a Japanese restaurant, and Wigand asks Bergman about his background, but he's reluctant and steers the conversation back to Wigand. He wants to know why Wigand was fired. Wigand says that he drinks too much occasionally and confesses that he was once arrested for shoplifting, but that was a mistake. He can only react angrily because he doesn't like being pushed around. Wigand, on cue, gets quite aggressive, saying he's just a commodity to Bergman. Bergman doesn't sugarcoat anything back to Wigand and says that if he goes on 60 Minutes, nothing in his life will ever be the same again. Do we want to quickly look at all that stuff? The intimidation.
In reality, Bergman's trying to get Wigand to agree to be interviewed on 60 Minutes. He knows that Jeffrey's already agreed to testify on behalf of ABC News at a court hearing where they're being sued by Philip Morris for a similar cigarettes aren't good for you story that they were running. Bergman was furious that Wigand agreed to have his name listed as a witness, so he knew they'd have to move fast, because basically that information's in the public domain that Wigand is going to appear as a witness against the tobacco industry. His original plan was to have Wigand interviewed, record it, but then sit on the story until how they saw the land lay. But they also realised that the court story, once the court story was out there and his evidence enters the public record, the B&W confidentiality agreement's not worth the paper it's written on, because he's not saying anything that isn't already out there, and again this would get round the court hearing. Mike Wallace later said he thought at this stage it was a harmless way of keeping a source happy and feeling valued, but he doubted that the interview would ever see the light of day. The incident with the boots in Jeffrey's garden, it's not specifically referred to in accounts we've read, but it does reinforce the general impression that he had, that he was being followed, and there were some very real threats that came by post, came through the mail. The impression we get about Lowell Bergman as well seems pretty spot on. He never sugarcoated anything, and one of the reasons this became such a big deal for him is he never made promises to potential sources that he couldn't back up, or so he believed. And we'll get to the CBS internecine struggles a little bit later on.
So back to the movie, we see the 60 Minutes team are watching coverage of a Louisiana police story when Bergman calls one Richard Scruggs, a former US Navy pilot and now trial lawyer who has begun legal proceedings against the tobacco industry in Mississippi. He says he may be able to give Wigand some legal protection, but they need to know what his intentions are. Bergman says he'll try and get Jeffrey to call the Louisiana legal representatives. At Wigand's house, we see his wife. She's opening an email, and the message comes up: "We will kill you. We will kill all of you. Shut the F up." His wife is nearly hysterical at this threat when Wigand returns home. Back to Bergman, we see him on the scene of a murder. It's unconnected to the story about tobacco, we believe, when Wigand calls him and says that if his former bosses think they can threaten him into silence, he wants to go on record. Bergman advises him to call the FBI because he's feeling threatened with the email and other things. We see two FBI agents arrive at Wigand's house, and we learn that he's also received a bullet in the mailbox. The agents seem more concerned about what caliber Wigand's own pistol is, and we see them take away his computer. They ask him if he has a history of emotional issues, so they're hardly sympathetic to a man whose family and life are under threat. We see Bergman on the phone to a senior FBI official saying that if either of those agents happen to have an ex-supervisor who is already working at Brown and Williamson and who may have offered these two FBI agents a job in corporate security when they retire, ... And we're getting the message from Bergman's accusations that this is an industry that plays dirty and it has tentacles that reach very far. The FBI man replies that he'll check it out, but he's a bit swamped as they're chasing the Unabomber.
Yeah, which of course reminds us that these things don't happen, in isolation, and the rest of the world is turning and things are happening at the same time. Richard Scruggs, what a remarkable character. He was an A-6 bomber pilot, and before he came to represent Mississippi against Big Tobacco, he'd already represented some 10,000 shipyard workers in a case over the use of asbestos in the 1980s. He was a lawyer, born to a very, very wealthy family who used large quantities of his own money to finance his cases. He really does sound like quite a philanthropist. The timeline was slightly different. Scruggs didn't actually become involved until slightly later in the story, but it was Mississippi Attorney General Michael Moore, no relation of the film producer. He'd said that the state couldn't use taxpayers' money in a risky litigation case against Tobacco Inc., so Scruggs put up millions of his own money in that case. The death threat, there were several received by Wigand. One quoted in Marie Brenner's Vanity Fair article, which she was actually shown, said, "We want you to know that we have not forgotten you or your little brats. If you think we are going to let you ruin our lives, you're in for a big surprise. You can't keep the bodyguards forever, asshole." And they did indeed receive a bullet in the mailbox. So, and the bodyguard bit we'll get on to. The bit about the FBI agents really not paying the slightest bit of credence to what he's saying may or may not be true, but again, you just see, like you said, the tentacles of the tobacco industry, which makes hundreds of billions of dollars every year collectively, maybe not be hundreds of billions, but it's certainly an enormous quantity of money. They are quite happy to play dirty.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the movie. Jeffrey and his wife Leanne are at dinner with Lowell Bergman and journalist Mike Wallace. And that's when Leanne discovers that her husband is planning to do an interview, so he's not shared the fact that he's going to do it with her. She's furious and storms off, but we cut to a studio where Jeffrey's being interviewed by Mike Wallace, so she doesn't stop her. Wigand is saying that cigarettes are a nicotine delivery product and that Brown and Williamson are enhancing the effects of nicotine by mixing it with chemicals such as ammonia. He says that they're also developing a compound to replace a known carcinogen called coumarin without changing the taste too much, but they failed to do so. Wigand was told that they wouldn't stop using the carcinogen as it would hurt sales. Wigand sent a memo to CEO Mr. Sandifer that he couldn't continue working on such a product, and he was told to mind his own business. Shortly after, Wigand was quired for, quote, poor communication skills, unquote. So this is the recording of the 60 Minutes interview. It's not the broadcast of it yet, but it's a pivotal scene, it's a pivotal interview, it's a very historic moment that they were just trying to deliver. How did they go?
Yeah, very well. The dinner was spot on, except Mike Wallace wasn't there. It was Lowell Bergman, and he's talked about that when he had dinner with Jeffrey and Lucretia, which is his wife's real name, and it became clear that Jeffrey hadn't told her about the possibility of being interviewed for 60 Minutes. He was expecting Lowell Bergman to sell it to her, and he said, yeah, I didn't do a great job of that, and she did storm off. And it was about now that they made the recording of the full interview.
That's right, and when he's talking about nicotine, a cigarette as a nicotine delivery vehicle, which Mike Wallace's character repeats back to him, as I said in the original 60-minute interview, it plays out exactly as they show, shot for shot it seems, eyebrow raised for eyebrow raised, word for word, when you're watching the original 60-minute interview. It's really very well done, and I did hear some comments about the direction of this movie and how you often see a full head in the camera, and it'll be Wigand, it'll be Russell Crowe's head, the slightly round, paunchy face, and that one of the critics said this was a bit jarring, a bit too in your face, as it were. But when I realised that they're pivoting part of the movie on a television interview, and television is all about talking heads, it sort of made sense that the director would go like this. And as I say, it's really good recreation of the.
Well, also, I mean, there's the movie happened so close after the incidents it's portraying, within 3 years, that the movie actually became part of the story. And Lowell Bergman says that Michael Mann was saying to him, I'm going to change the name of the movie. It's not going to be called The Inside. It's going to be called The Phone. Because all you people do is just make phone calls. That's not good for television, for movies. And Lowell Bergman laughed and said, well, we're a big country and we've got people we need to talk to all over the country. So I'm afraid that's what we do. We spend most of our time on the phone. And we do need to mention as well, Debbie DeLuca. Debbie comes up quite a bit. She wasn't, I think I described her as a research assistant. She was a reporter. And one criticism I've read aimed at Lowell Bergman is that her part is downplayed, and actually she did an awful lot of the legwork. Lowell Bergman's defence is, he said, I didn't claim to have done anything I didn't do, but when someone's making a movie, they condense it to reduce the number of characters, which is easier to follow, and of course it's cheaper. He's basically saying, look, I didn't claim anything I didn't do. The movie makers have given me a larger role than I in reality had.
Okay, so shall we get back to the action?
Sure.
We cut to a scene where we see Jeffrey Wigand. He's at his school, where he is now a teacher, and he meets his new students. He appears cheerful, if slightly nervous. Later, he calls Richard Scruggs, who tells him that they're taking on the tobacco industry in Mississippi, and he'd like to meet Wigand. Arriving home, Wigand sees a strange man in his house and panics until he sees Lowell Bergman there as well, who's arranged this guy to act as private security for him free of charge. I think there's two men doing the job. Leanne is less than impressed and invites Jeffrey to, quote, explain our new house gets to your children. We learn that the meeting with Scruggs is going ahead. His wife is clearly under stress with the situation and probably feels like he's putting his family at risk in the interest of revenge or easing his conscience. That night, we see Jeffrey working in his basement when Leanne comes downstairs and tells them that she can't do this anymore. She wants to stand by him but feels that she can't. She says she's sorry, but it sounds pretty final. He asks if they can talk about it when he gets back from Mississippi. She says, yes, Jeffrey, and she sighs and goes back to bed.
Yeah, and you get the feeling that that was okay, that your response has just confirmed my worst feelings about it. The reality there, he did really start working at DuPont High School, earning a tenth of what he earned working for Brown and Williamson. CBS did pay for Wigand to have security, although it's not clear if it began at this stage. His main security guard, who was in place when he met Marie Brenner for the Vanity Fair article, was Doug Sykes, who was an ex-Secret Service agent.
Jesus.
So CBS didn't scrimp there. They got the very best. Lucretia, Jeffrey's wife, did indeed tell him that she couldn't cope with the situation and felt he was putting his family's lives at risk by pursuing his vendetta against B&W. She seems to have felt he was being a bit Don Quixote and he was tilting at windmills. She's not portrayed very favourably by the movie, it must be said. You know, like when he tells her he's fired near the beginning of the movie, and her first thing is, well, how are we going to pay for the cars and the house and, you know...
Health insurance.
Yeah. Now, the health insurance, they had a daughter, in reality, with spina bifida, as opposed to with asthma, but yeah. So health payments would have been a concern. So I don't think she's entirely vacuous and just looking at the money, but it must have put an awful lot of stress. But he does seem to be very single-minded. You can see lots of interviews with the real Jeffrey Wigand. He looks like, I mean, if you wanted someone to play Father Christmas as a nativity play, you know, at a kid's party, he'd be perfect. He's slightly rotund, very cheerful, jolly-looking chap, speaks very well, but there's clearly a steely determination in there, which may be satisfied to the exclusion of other people's feelings. You know, you can understand that he's like, no, this is what I've got to do. You come along for the ride or you don't.
Yeah, and there is sort of a suggestion. Did you pick up from the movie the suggestion that Wigand actually likes being the centre of attention? And he wasn't just necessarily altruistic reasons. He liked being, you know, sticking it back to his old employer. But I think he sort of smiles a few times when the cameras are around. I just got this impression that he liked being the centre of attention, a little slightly narcissistic. Did you pick up on that?
From what I've read and the footage I've seen of the real person, if that was Michael Mann's intention, or Russell Crowe's intention with Michael Mann's guidance, I feel it's slightly misplaced.
It might be just me.
But you do get the sense that he is aware of the value of his information, and I think he probably wants that to be acknowledged and recognised. So to that degree, yes, but not so much that he wants to be a superstar. You know.
No, I wouldn't suggest that necessarily. But okay, let's just park that for the moment. It's just an observation I wanted to make.
Yeah, interesting one. I think that might be in the eye of the beholder, and you might be looking with a more discerning eye than I had. But
let's see. Okay, so get back to the movie. We see Wigand arrived at an airport where his security team leads him through the arrivals hall. A stranger approaches them and throws some papers at Jeffrey, saying, "You've been served." So there's been some legal action. So this is Mississippi, and we see Richard Scruggs explaining to Jeffrey that it's a Kentucky restraining order, but it's been thrown out by the Mississippi courts. However, should Jeffrey testify in Mississippi and then return to Kentucky, he could be found in contempt of court and jailed. He just needs to be aware of this. He wants to know what would happen if he goes to jail. How will his wife live? Michael Moore, the Mississippi attorney working with Richard Scruggs, is present, and he's very sympathetic. He says he hopes that Jeffrey testifies. It'll help their case, but he'll understand that if Jeffrey can't. He'll understand that if he can't. Scruggs tells him that he once flew A6s in Vietnam and combat was stressful.
Sorry, that's my mistake. He doesn't claim that he flew in Vietnam, and he didn't fly in Vietnam. He was on a Mediterranean fleet. He did fly, I believe, some combat missions, but they weren't in Vietnam.
Okay, so he was he flew in combat in the Mediterranean, you say?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. We're outside now, and we see Wigand chatting to Bergman. He's still undecided about what to do. We see Scruggs' legal team, led by Ron Motley, played by Bruce McGill, arriving at the court, immediately swarmed by reporters. Inside the court, the tobacco industry lawyers ask Motley if he expects his witness to appear. So we've got Wigman outside. He still hasn't made his mind up, and people are getting worried if he's going to appear or not. We see Jeffrey still pacing out by the sea. He's with Bergman and Scruggs. He says he can't find a criteria to decide. Eventually he simply says, "F it, let's go to court," and they're off. A convoy pulls out, complete with patrol cars to protect him and police outriders to take Jeffrey to the courthouse. The media scrum create a barrier through which Jeffrey is led. Ron Motley tells him that they'll get straight into the session, as he doesn't want to give any more chance to get some other restraining order served against Jeffrey. Ron Motley in the court reminds him that this is not a trial, simply a deposition, but Jeffrey is under oath. As Motley tries to begin questioning Wigand, the tobacco industry lawyer on the other side of the court keeps interrupting, and he keeps reminding Wigand that if he answers, he'll be in breach of his non-disclosure agreement and that restraining order. Ron Motley eventually explodes, and he roars at the other lawyer that this is Mississippi and he will hear Dr. Wigand's testimony. And we've got a clip of Ron Motley's character now.
In other words, it acts as a drug.
I object to the form of question.
It acts as a drug on the body?
Object to the form.
It acts as a drug.
Object!
Will you then echo in here? Your objection's been recorded. She typed it into her little machine over there. It's on the record. So now, I'll proceed with my deposition of my witness. Does it act as a drug?
Dr. Wigand, I am instructing you not to answer that question. In accordance to the terms of the contractual obligations undertaken by you, not to disclose any information about your work at the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company, and in accordance with the force and effect of the temporary restraining order that has been entered against you by the court in the state of Kentucky. That means you don't talk. Mr. Motley, we have rights here.
Oh, you got rights. And lefts. Ups and downs and middles. So what? You don't get to instruct anything around here. This is not North Carolina, not South Carolina, nor Kentucky. This is the sovereign state of Mississippi's proceeding. Wipe that smirk off your face! Dr. Wigand's deposition will be part of this record. And I'm going to take my witness's testimony whether the hell you like it or not.
And after the clip, we then see a smiling Wigand sharing a drink with Lowell Bergman. There's quite a lot to unpack there. The Kentucky restraining order was served against Jeffrey Wigand. The Mississippi legal team did have to look for a way around it, and a Mississippi court threw it out and said, no, we're not applying by that. But there was this risk, and as Richard Scruggs said to him, he said, look, flying in combat is very stressful, but it only lasts a few minutes. If you take the stand, this will go on and on. And again, no one's sugarcoating things. They weren't saying, oh, it will be fine. What also happened around this time is the ABC court case against Philip Morris, after which Lowell Bergman expected a confidentiality agreement with B&W to lose its weight, got settled out of court, so it became a dead duck. ABC settled, issued a fairly abject apology for their earlier story, but because Wigand's name had been on the list of witnesses, everyone knew that he'd been willing to testify. So the warning that he could go to jail and return to Kentucky was sincere, and it was taken seriously by both Jeffrey Wigand and the legal team. He did have to think long and hard, and supposedly he genuinely said, oh, bleep it, let's go to court. That's word for word accurate, but he didn't say it to Lowell Bergman and Richard Scruggs. He said it to Ephraim Margolin, who was his lawyer. We're not even sure that Lowell Bergman was actually at the Mississippi court hearings. The lawyer who is shouted at and told to wipe that smirk off your face, rather wonderfully by Bruce McGill playing Ron Motley, he's sort of representative of, there were 45 tobacco industry lawyers present. Apparently they'd been taking bets on whether Jeffrey Wigand would turn up or not, and the real Ron Motley says that he was pretty apprehensive until Jeffrey arrived. The explosion we see from Motley may not be word for word accurate, but it does seem to pretty accurately capture the style of his counterattack, something for which he was very well known. So this, for once, this is not a dramatic insertion to give us all a yes, get in my son moment. This actually happened, and he apparently told them, if you can't be quiet, get out and I'll continue my deposition on my own with Dr. Wigand and the court recorder.
And just one or two other comments about the accuracy of that scene in the courtroom. Apparently, it is the very room where the deposition hearing took place. And
yeah, it was a temporary courtroom, wasn't it? And I think it was in a school.
Yeah, and
the
other thing too is that the Mississippi Attorney General, the character Michael Moore, is played by the then Attorney General of Mississippi, Michael Moore. So the guy that was the Attorney General plays himself in the movie.
And because I was watching, I thought, I've got to dig out into this. Why did they get this multi-police patrol car and motorcycle outrider escort? That seems like officialdom supporting him. Of course, he was representing Mississippi's own Attorney General, so he had the full weight of the state behind him. And whatever we think about certain elements of like you think about Mississippi's burning, this was Mississippi taking the lead. And we'll get to where it led later on, but yeah.
Good job. Okay, so back to the movie. We see the 60-minute team together, and they're happy with what they've got. They're watching their show with the CEOs collectively denying that nicotine is addictive, followed by Jeffrey stating that this is misstatements and in contradiction to common language within the tobacco industry. They know that everyone knows they're using cigarettes as a nicotine delivery device and using ammonia chemistry to enhance the addictive effects. Being driven home by the journalist, Jeffrey sees a burning car on the side of the road and a cop in another car who's staring back at him. He's clearly nervous but arrives home safely where the security team are still in situ. However, his wife and daughters are not home. He finds a note from Leanne and he realises that she has finally left him. At CBS headquarters, the owners of the 60-minute show, Helen Caparelli, a senior CBS official, speaks to Bergman and Wallace about a legal concept called tortious interference. This involves a third party being sued for persuading one side of a confidentiality agreement to break that agreement. Bergman and Wallace give a very robust response, saying that they're investigative journalists and all that stuff is what the lawyers are for.
Yeah, they're basically they're saying this is what we do, and we've never lost a lawsuit. But the woman, she's CBS's general counsel. She insists that there are problems, and Bergman says they only need to ensure that what Wigand says is true. And then she turns that on his head, and she says, no. The more truth in it, the greater the damage, because the company owns the information that he's disclosing. It's all about intellectual copyright. She says if they play the segment with Wigand's evidence against Brown and Williamson and it goes badly from a legal perspective, the tobacco company could end up owning CBS because of the amount that they're likely to sue them for.
All of which sounds ridiculous to us, but I guess like...
She's saying...
Go on.
I mean, she's saying that the truer it is, it's not defamation, this is about intellectual property. So the reality... the timeline of whether this is the accurate time that Lucretia left Jeffrey taking the daughters isn't necessarily accurate. I'm not sure, it might be, but the story is pretty complex and it's quite hard to separate one element from another and the various timelines. But it did happen, and Jeffrey found himself ostracised by her whole family. In his own words, he was disinvited from Christmas at her parents' place, which I thought was a nice use of words. The Helen Caparelli scene, in reality, her name was Ellen Caden. She was CBS's general counsel. And this is a key scene because pretty much half of the movie's message is about corporate interference in media reporting. And it's probably the element that has most resonance for us today, even 20 years after the event's been portrayed. What isn't covered is that there are several strings to the warning. It was mainly about B&W suing CBS that concerned them, especially after ABC News had caved into Philip Morris a few months earlier. But also, the CBS owner was a entrepreneur called Lawrence Tisch. He had a son, Andrew, who was CEO of Lorillard, who were a major US tobacco company. So if they run this piece, it might put the chairman's son in an awkward position, or possibly even in jail. So there are layers of depth that I quite understand the movie can't really get into. It's looking at the surface material, but there are things going on in the background here that, they refer to Tisch once or twice. You hear the name come up, and Don Hewitt, the producer, the executive producer of 60 Minutes, who will come across very shortly, he would say, look, I'd not like nothing more than to stick it to Tisch. And one of the backgrounds to this was when he bought the company and realised he couldn't control what CBS News reported, he slashed their budget, which he was entitled to. So they were working on far more of a shoestring budget than they'd been used to. And one of the things that 60 Minutes used to go out. I think it was on Friday night, and they used to do, CBS News would broadcast an American football match, at the end of which was 60 Minutes show. And a lot of people would just stay tuned and watch that. And he got rid of the rights to show that Friday night football, and they were worried they'd lose viewers. So, yeah, there's
a lot going on there.
That's going on. Yeah,
there's a lot going on in the film when they suggest that through various legal repercussions that they might get owned by the very company that they're investigating. But there's more than an element of truth to that from what you've just told us. They're pretty accurate.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So continuing with the movie, clearly rattled, Bergman is then told by a suit, supported by executive producer Don Hewitt, played by Philip Baker Hall, that they should edit an alternative version of their show without Wigand's evidence. So continue to anti-tobacco story, but just cut Wigand's interview out of it completely, just in case their legal advice suggests that they will be sued, in fact, as they're fearing. Bergman has made some inquiries on his own and has found that CBS is undergoing a sale from one owner to another. He points out that a possible multi-million-dollar lawsuit, as we've said, against CBS by Brown & Tobacco would damage CBS's share price, and Ms. Caporelli could lose considerable value in her personal portfolio. Bergman accuses them all of worrying about their own bank balances and telling him to hang Wigand out to dry after that guy went out on a limb to talk to them. He says that this is what he and Mike do. This is 60 Minutes, when Mike quietly tells him that on this one he agrees with the bosses. So he's been hung out to dry by Mike Wallace. Bergman walks out and goes home, where his wife is sympathetic and supportive. Wigand calls him and tells him that his wife is filing for divorce and that he's currently staying in a hotel room. Bergman reluctantly tells him that Brown and Williamson may be suing CBS, and Wigand's testimony may not see the light of day. Jeffrey is quietly furious, understandably, and hangs up.
And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week, so that wraps up part 2. And I'd like to take this opportunity to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas. If you are listening to this in the days leading up, it is this week. If you don't hear this till after Christmas, I hope you had a very happy Christmas and you have a great New Year. We'll be back next week with the concluding part 3 of The Insider, and that will also wrap up our output for this year. So thank you so much, everybody, for all your support, for the correspondence, for the listens, for the downloads, for the likes, for the reviews. It's been fab, and next year we'll be heading into our 4th year. And with my favourite Christmas tune, we're going to see ourselves out. So we'll speak to you next week. Have a great time, and thank you.
You promised me Broadway was waiting for me. You were handsome. You were pretty queen of New York City. When the band finished playing, they held out for more. Sinatra was swinging, all the junk they were singing. We kissed on the corner, then danced through the night. The boys of the NYPD chorus still singing Go Away Brave, and the bells are ringing out for Christmas Day.